All right, this is going to be the first in our series of accurizing the standard Ruger 1022 Sporter rifle. This is going to cover how to free float the barrel. There's going to be certain materials and tools that we're going to need to do this task. Most of these are very easy to acquire and relatively inexpensive. All right, we're going to start first with over here. Now, this is not necessarily cheap. I think it's $30 or $40. It's just a simple inch-pound torque wrench. This is good to have for any Ruger 1022 in order to properly set the torque on your action screw. It's going to be different for every rifle, and you're going to want to determine what your torque spec is on your rifle. It's usually going to be somewhere between 15 and 20 inch-pounds. Once you have determined the best setting for your rifle, you can easily refer back to that using that torque wrench anytime you have to disassemble and reassemble your rifle. Next tool that we have over here is just an X-Acto knife. This is a kit, but you can use just a straight, simple X-Acto knife. This is going to be needed later when we get to bedding of the action, the epoxy, prior to it curing completely. When it's still malleable, is going to be trimmed away using the X-Acto blades. Next, we have a shoe shine brush and some Kiwi Parade Gloss shoe shine. This is clear shoe shine. This is going to be used to coat the areas of the receiver and the barrel that we do not want our epoxy to adhere to when we are bedding the first couple inches of our barrel to our stock. All right, if you don't use that, that epoxy is going to bond onto the barrel, and then you're going to have a permanent bond. We want to be able to separate that, of course, when we do our bedding, so that we can disassemble it and assemble it easily later. We're also going to need some epoxy, right? What I would recommend is you don't necessarily need to use JB Weld, but I'm using this because it has a 6-hour plus cure time. You don't want to use an epoxy with a very fast cure time because you're going to want to be able to take that action out of the stock at the appropriate time before it is cured, so that you can trim away any excess epoxy from the areas where you do not want it. Modeling clay. Modeling clay is going to be handy in order to squeeze into certain recesses of the receiver or the barrel, and it will never harden up so you can pull it away. What that's going to do is keep that epoxy from squeezing into those little cracks and crevices in your action or along your barrel where you don't want it to get to, and then you can just simply it's going to follow the form of the epoxy. Basically, if you have a screw hole, you put that, and you won't really need it for bedding of the barrel to the stock as much as you're going to need it if you're going to bed your, let's say, your scope base to your receiver, right, to fill in your screw holes with. But anytime I'm doing bedding, I like to have the modeling clay on hand. Right, a flathead screwdriver, all right, and then for inletting of the stock, we're going to need to have some sandpaper. I've got some 180 grit here. You'll go a little bit slower with the 180 grit, but it'll give you a smoother finish. You can use probably a 120 or even an 80 if you want to get things going a little bit quicker. Next, we have some sockets. I have 3 different long sockets, a 7/16, a 1/2, and a 5/8. These are going to be used when you're going to wrap your sandpaper around your socket and follow the profile of the barrel. The front of the barrel channel is going to be the narrowest, where you're going to probably start out with a 7/16 socket. As you sand away more material, you're going to switch to a 1/2. As you sand away more material, you're going to switch to a 5/8. I just have a card here, or either an index card or a playing card, a business card, something like that, so that we can check the amount of gap that we have between our stock and our barrel when we're doing our sanding process, and then later when it's complete to verify that we have a correct free float. Next, you're going to want to have some painter's tape. This is going to be used to tape off sections of your stock that you do not want to have the epoxy remaining in. This again is going to be, like I said, the epoxy will be trimmed with that X-Acto knife, and then all the epoxy forward of that area that's riding on top of your tape where you don't want it. You're just going to peel that tape away, and that's going to keep that epoxy from sticking to your stock where you don't want it. And then also we're going to want to have some spar urethane or some other kind of wood finish to reseal the wood once we've inletted it with our sandpaper and our sockets to relieve the barrel. You're going to want to protect that raw wood again with some sort of sealer. I have spar urethane on hand, so that's what I used. All right, we're going to go ahead and cut and go to the outdoors where I'll have the action screw removed. We'll remove the rifle from the stock, and we'll go over the procedure on how you properly free float your barrel. All right, we're going to go over the first couple of steps in the process to free float the barrel on a Sporter Ruger 1022 stock. All right, we've already got our action screw loosened and taken down, so we can remove our barreled action from our stock. I'm going to go set this aside. Now you may notice I have some tape here. That's just to prevent my recoil pin from falling out. You're going to be putting this in and taking it out quite a bit, so if you want to cover that up with a piece of painter's tape like I did here, that'll make it easier and you're not having to constantly pick it up. I'm going to set this off to the side for now. All right, now in our stock, you can see what's already been done here if we have a look. This is the section of the stock all the way back to here actually that was inletted using the 180 grit sandpaper with our sockets. And then this is our epoxy bedding area here, which serves as a leverage point forward of our action screw to lift our barrel up out of our stock once the whole process is complete. First thing you're going to do, you're going to remove your stock, and you're going to start with a small socket. This is a 7/16. You're going to pull off a strip of sandpaper that is about the length of the socket, wrap it around your socket, hold it in place, and then you're going to run your socket forward and back along the barrel channel of your stock. It's going to be tight up here at first with the 7/16 socket because the area of your stock width up here is going to be relatively narrow with that Sporter barrel. As you go, you're going to keep refitting your action into your barrel, dropping it in without the action screw, just pushing down at the rear of your receiver and checking for our free float condition. Oh, let me get my safety half on, half off there. That'll make that easier. All right, and you'll check as you go. And you're going to find you're always going to have a pinch point up here. All right, and that's going to remain the case even with your stock properly inletted, because at this point you won't have that bedding area forward of your action screw to support your barrel just in front of the receiver. Later, once that is done and it's set up and you tighten that action screw, it's actually going to lift the barrel up away from the stock. So don't overdo it on this, although you may need to do it more than you think. Once you've gone with your 7/16 socket, you'll probably move up to your 1/2 and then to your 5/8 socket. And you're going to keep sanding out the area inside of your stock until eventually what you're going to notice when you have your bedded, when you have your action and barrel reinstalled in the stock, when you come back here, you're going to feel just a little bit of resistance in this area, and then everything else behind it is going to be pretty much free, and that's going to go all the way back to here. It might get a little bit tight back in this area, but this area might pinch just a little bit. As you go back, it should go pretty much all the way back to here. Now, that's not going to be the case in this rifle because it's already had the bedding, the epoxy bedding done. So, let me remove our barreled action out. Once we've inletted our stock with our sandpaper all the way back, all the way through, and we have just a slight little resistance underneath here with our index card, doubled over piece of paper, whatever you're using, then we're going to go ahead and reseal this area. Now for that, I'm using spar urethane with a paintbrush. You're going to want to do at least 2 coats, probably 3. Coat all the area of the raw wood, set it out in the sun, and let it cure for about 30 minutes. You're then going to apply a second coat, and again, let it cure for about 30 minutes. And then a third coat if you want. I think I only did 2 coats on this. Now, having a bipod, this is a Harris bipod, and a sand sock is going to make this process a little easier. It's going to hold your stock, in a stable position for you. You can pick it up to do your sanding, but when you're setting it down and placing your receiver in there, to check with your index card if you have your free float conditions met. It's just going to be like a nice kind of portable vise for you. Nice little stable rest. All right, next we're going to talk about how we do our epoxy bedding to provide that pivot point forward of our action screw. All right, we'll go ahead and cut to that with the materials that we're going to need to do that portion. All right, once we've inletted our stock and our spar urethane is completely dry, we're going to be ready to do our epoxy bed. For that, I'm using just regular automotive JB weld. You're going to want to have an applicator and a stir stick. I just use a popsicle stick. Before we do that, you're going to want to take your barrel action, and we're going to want to use our shoe shine brush and our parade gloss, and we're going to want to coat with a good coat of shoe polish all of our areas around the sides, bottom of the barrel, up to about this point here, and our action block all the way around. Now we have a screw hole here. It's not likely the epoxy is going to get in there, but what I would do is take some of our modeling clay and stuff it down in there. Not too much. You just want to make sure it doesn't allow the epoxy to squirt in there, because if it does, it's going to be hell to get out. It's a lot easier to get out the modeling clay, since it's never going to harden on you. All right, so once we've used our shoe shine brush and our parade gloss, we've got everything, all the metal parts of our barrel, our action block, and the front areas of our receiver coated with that parade gloss. We're going to set that aside. We're going to squirt out equal parts of our JB weld. This is going to require almost half of each tube in order to do. I would want to make sure that I maintain some in reserve, because you may need to add some more epoxy later. Now, if that's the case, you're going to want to have a pointy object like a nail, something to rough up the old epoxy, which will still be tacky at the time. We're going to be adding more if needed. That's just going to help the new epoxy bond onto the old epoxy by giving it a mechanical bond. All right, so once we mix up our epoxy, actually, let me back up. You want to take your painter's tape, and you're going to want to kind of visualize this area up here and put some painter tape going across and coming all the way down through that inletted area, right? Basically, that painter's tape is going to make a line right there. Just like if you were painting and you peeled away your painter's tape, it's going to leave a straight line there, right? And I'm also going to apply the painter's tape inside of the barrel channel. I'm going to put a couple layers up here, which is where we want to make sure our barrel is not touching. This is going to be very important when we do our epoxy bed, because if the barrel is touching our stock when we do our epoxy bed, it's going to be touching our stock when our epoxy is cured. So a couple layers of tape up here, and then I'll take also a business card thicker than this, right, and I'll fold it down in there. That's going to come later though. All right, we'll mix up our epoxy, and we're going to start applying it in this area. There's going to be a shelf just forward of where your action block is, and you're going to apply your epoxy forward of that approximately 1.5 inches up to this area here, which is going to be protected by the painter's tape. You're going to build it up rather thick. You can see this is about an 1/8 of an inch up above our inletted area of our stock, and it's going to be quite a bit more back in this area. That said, if we apply too much, it's going to make cleanup rather messy. You can always come back later and add more epoxy if needed, and that was the case with me. I had to come back and add more epoxy later. I think I used about 1/4 of each tube, and then I noticed that my bedding area, which is nice and even, coming from here to here
up to each side, a nice rectangular area there coming all the way around the barrel. That was kind of only about 30% of this area was actually in contact with the barrel. That's why I had to come back later and add some more epoxy. So we're going to build up our epoxy here, and then we're going to place our action in. Once your action goes in, remember you've got all your parade gloss coating all the metal surfaces of your barrel and your receiver to keep any of that epoxy from sticking to it. You're going to put it in, get that safety again. And then you're going to snug up your action screw. Now when I say snug up, I mean just that. You're going to snug it up. If you use an inch-pound wrench and you're shooting for around 15 to 20 inch-pounds, when your bedding is completely hardened up, I would not tighten that action screw more than about 10 inch-pounds. Once it's tightened up, if you happen to see epoxy is squirting up around the edges here, you've probably applied too much. But we can still recover from that. You just take a Q-tip, right? And I'll use a little bit of acetone with that Q-tip, and I'll wipe away that epoxy while it's still in a really liquid kind of state from all those edges. You know, clean it up with a toothpick and Q-tips around the edges here. We're then going to go ahead and wait. Now what I would recommend is the surface that you use to mix your epoxy on, keep that, don't throw it away. That's going to give us an indicator of the condition that our epoxy inside here, what state it's in. We're going to want to pull our action when this epoxy is still, is hard, but still somewhat where you can basically poke a toothpick into it with force, you know, and make an indentation. That way you'll be able to trim away any excess. If you pull your action out too soon, the epoxy bedding isn't going to work. It's going to just make a mess when you pull it out. So this is a 6-hour cure epoxy. On mine, I waited 4 hours. I probably could have pulled the action at 3 hours, but 4 hours is what I wanted to make sure that the epoxy would be set up enough to where when I pulled my action, it would keep its form properly. So after our 4 hours, we're going to loosen that action screw, take it back out, pull it out, and then we're going to have a look at our bedding area here and see if we have full contact, you know, front to back and side to side in the entire area. If not, we'll be needing to add more epoxy. If we're there, then we're good and we can go ahead and trim it. That said, if you're going to need to add more epoxy, you're going to want to make sure you trim away the currently applied epoxy before you do so, because that stuff that you put on 4 hours ago, when it's time to pull the action again in another 4 hours, if you need to add the epoxy, that stuff will be too hard to trim up with an X-Acto knife. So let's say we had enough epoxy to get our full coverage front to back and side to side to follow the form of our barrel just in front of our action screw. We're then going to take an X-Acto knife and we're going to cut that area right here, right where that edge of tape was. This is going to be a little bit hard. You're going to need to poke into it, kind of go slow until you get it. If you pull it before 4 hours, it might make it a little bit easier, but then again, you run into the danger of this not having a chance to form and match up to your the bottom of your barrel in that 1.5 inches of area that we're trying to bed in the barrel. Trim it away with your X-Acto knife, and then you can remove the tape, right? Once you've removed the tape from there, I try to leave the tape in the channel here, the tape up here. I put my business card back in up here where your barrel band would normally go. I put my action back in, and then I'll tighten it back up to about 10 inch-pounds. From there, I'm going to wait 24 hours, right? So we put our action in. Dang safety again. Right, tighten up our action screw to approximately 10 inch-pounds. Now after 24 hours, you're going to go ahead and loosen your action screw. In case I didn't mention, That action screw, you're probably going to want to coat that with wax. And backing up, this is where your action screw goes into. You're not going to want to put the modeling clay in there. Disregard that. You are going to want to put the parade gloss in there, right? Just in case epoxy gets in there. But like I said, if you're in, it should not come back into the action block area when you apply it, unless you just apply way too much. Then it could be a problem. So after we've waited our 24 hours, you're going to see that your action is going to feel like it's stuck in the stock. But if you hold it up, tuck it into your back, and give your barrel a nice little slap here, it will break that bond between the epoxy and the barrel, because you have everything here coated with that parade gloss, right? It's going to allow it to break loose from that epoxy. Same thing as when we would have taken it out before. You're then going to check everything, right? Take out all of our tape, right, all the way up here. Reinstall our barreled action. And then when we tighten it back up, I'm just going to snug this back up. We're going to confirm that everything was a success. Let me just get my action screw snugged up without the torque wrench here. Just a good guesstimate. About tight enough. All right. Now, when you tighten that action screw, it's going to pull down on your action block and also pull down the barrel that was bedded against the epoxy. Pull that down and cause this to lift up, kind of like a seesaw. That's going to be a pivot point. I'm going to check with a business card, dollar bill, whatever you want. Make sure that you got that nice free float area. All right, my scope's getting a little bit in the way, but it should come all the way back to where that epoxy bedding ended at, right there. Should have nice and free and easy motion all the way back to there. And that will be a successful free float job on a sporter stock. You're not going to be reinstalling your barrel band. You're going to be leaving that out. If you reinstall the barrel band, it's going to defeat the entire purpose of doing the free float. All right, so that's it on how to free float the 1022 sporter stock. I hope that you give it a try. It's not very difficult. And for all the improvements that I did, I would say that one by itself gave the greatest improvement in accuracy to the rifle. See you next time.